Rohan, do you think we're witnessing the slow death of the standalone provider here in Australia?
Well,
Welcome back to Talk Aged Care. We're very pleased to have Rohan Harris, partner from Russell Kennedy Lawyers here to talk about all things mergers and acquisitions. For people who may not know your background, Rohan, you spend a lot of time advising providers on mergers, acquisitions, and strategic transitions across the sector. So you've got a pretty clear view of what's actually happening behind the scenes. If you could please introduce yourself to our audience.
yeah, thanks, Mark, for having me. Pleasure to be here and share some insights into what's going on. I've probably had the benefit of maybe more than 20 years experience in the sector doing mergers and acquisitions work in particular. It's one of the firm's specialties at Russell Kennedy. And we service our clients across the country out of our Sydney office where I'm located and also out of Melbourne. So, yeah, we have a deep expertise in the sector and our teams work well, and we actually like being in the sector. We like working with communities that really matter, I think, to the Australian public, and I certainly regard aged care as one of those areas. And that's why we're heavily invested and experienced in the area.
Great to hear. I think as a firm, you're very dynamic in terms of your expertise. I know that you head up the M&A division at Russell Kennedy's, but in terms of as a firm, it's quite dynamic in the support that you provide to aged care providers.
Yeah, that's right. I think we like to see it as an end-to-end offering with key partners in all the different areas. So it sort of starts out in the regulatory compliance space, where we work with policymakers, with government in terms of reforms, certainly in the latest round of reforms with the new Aged Care Act. But it also extends into issues around workforce, employment matters, certainly real estate, dispute resolution, and in my area and my colleagues around mergers and acquisitions, which there's been plenty of it, and I think more to come.
That's right. Rohan, do you think we're witnessing the slow death of the standalone provider here in Australia?
Well, I think you only have to look at the sort of transactional activity that's been happening now for quite some time to that's not an unreasonable hypothesis. I think it's we've seen a lot of the exits that we work on, either on the buy side or the sell side, are for the smaller operators. And several transactions that I've got on at the moment, my colleagues are also concern single sites. So it's become more and more difficult for those sort of operations to be sustainable because of all the pressures that are currently impacting the industry and will continue.
That's right. There's a lot of layers now, and you've mentioned it now with the new Act, the compliance aspect. And I think the issue that we're having as a sector, and speaking to a lot of standalone providers and the CEOs, they haven't got the bench strength in terms of the head office supports to be able to be fully across it. They can give it a really good go, but that's not good enough, unfortunately. So in terms of when it comes to procurement, sourcing, or even their talent pools and workforce, they haven't got the ability to rely on a sister facility, half an hour away if there was an outbreak, or in terms of governance, they're struggling in that respect. So it's interesting to note that obviously, as a firm, you've got quite a few in the pipeline. And I think it's not new to us. We've seen over the last 18 months the amount of activity there's been, and the bigger providers, effectively the big fish is getting faster, I guess. But the smaller providers are being sort of pushed out, for want of a better term.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's no accident either that this is happening. For the reasons that you mentioned, but I also think it's certainly a policy of government to make this happen as well, because there's a definite reduction in the number of providers happening, and I think that's a deliberate approach of government to ensure that being driven by the outcomes of the Royal Commission and the policy thinking that the important functions that aged care providers offer to the community. And in an aged care scenario, the community is, it's a sensitive area of need for people who are reaching the end of their lives and needing that care. There's a vulnerable community there. The policy is that this is going to be best served by lesser number of operators who are better resourced to actually deliver what's required.
I agree. And when providers, sort of come to you now, are they still, coming to you to grow, or is it more of them quietly trying to work out how to exit well?
Well, it differs. So we act for buyers. So I'd say they're definitely looking for growth. That's part of their strategy. So there's definitely an appetite for investment. So having a discussion with them is very different to having a discussion with potential sellers who we also do act for. So yeah, often it's a very different scenario. Sometimes they're coming to us in a position of strength when they have a viable, profitable operations and they've just decided for other reasons that it's time for an exit. But it's not always that case either, where we often do work when the vendor, the selling entity, is in a distressed state, either financially or because of compliance issues. So we've certainly seen the full spectrum. So the discussion differs depending on what side of the fence we're on.
Sure, and you've mentioned it there in terms of the distressed state that some providers can be in, and we talk about the cracks in the walls sort of appearing. But where do you see the cracks in terms of, are we talking about workforce or governance? Is it occupancy or capital?
Oh, it's all of the above, I'd say. It's hard to identify. Like in some cases, it's more one of those factors than others, but often it's a combination. And it's sort of easy to see where a workforce challenge translates into a compliance challenge, particularly with the care minutes requirements and registered nurse requirements. It's sort of easy to see how one follows the other. They're all often interlinked. And a lot of that comes back to governance as well, where, if it's a single site operator, it's probably being governed all the way through by the person who founded the business, and often they've done their very best to ensure the care needs of residents are met. But, in today's world, that's not enough. And that's where more cracks appear, because often they don't know what they don't know, and they don't have the resources and the people with knowledge around them to try and help them. I think it's also there's a very tangible way in which this has also impacted recently, and that's around the part of the reforms were adding a requirement for majority of independent non-executive directors. And that's been a real challenge for private operators, not only to find the people with the right expertise, but then actually they're going from having a board table of one to suddenly having other people around the table with decision-making power and duties and responsibilities. And that's often a hard thing for private operators and founders who are used to running the whole show. Like, what does that mean for them? It's a big change. So,
yeah, I want to pick you up on 2 points there, and I agree. So the first one is regarding providers who've done everything themselves. They've worn every cap, and it's almost sort of operator fatigue, where they've had enough, wave the white flag, and they want to exit. But you've also mentioned, which is really critically important, regarding the roles and responsibilities of people sitting at the board. And gone were the days where rural community, you'd have Sally Smith there because her mum was a resident in the home years ago. There needs to be defined roles and responsibilities, and you need to be bringing something viable to the table, whether that's financial due diligence, being able to improve the commercial acumen of the site, or actually acting in a way that's going to assist the provider, as opposed to just being there for the afternoon tea and a chat.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's the sector. I think you're touching on what the community-based sector looks like potentially there with not-for-profit organisations, and there's many, many of those sorts of organisations out there. Typically, the board roles have been volunteer roles. Now, there's still a place for that, but it's not in this day and age, being a director of that sort of organisation is not sort of something you can drop in and out of. There's roles and responsibilities and duties that come with it. And yeah, again, attracting the right sort of people to fill those roles is becoming more challenging. Yeah, but it can't necessarily just be someone who's got that community-minded spirit about them, or some connection, or maybe they're the local doctor, or they have, that affiliation with the community. I think there's still a place for that, but yeah, there's got to be a place for people who are trained and understand the responsibilities that go with those sort of roles. And often that's going to come now with, they can't necessarily just be volunteer roles. So a lot of those non-executive positions are now paid positions.
Correct.
Which is an extra bill for the
Correct.
for the organisation as well. So it's difficult.
So I look back, and you just mentioned there in terms of they are paid positions. Some of them that do it quite well, and it is a cost to the P&L, but I think it's a necessary cost. I look at a provider we interviewed recently, John Clark, the CEO of Warrabundah Village, and again, it was a very community. People are part of the board because they lived in the area, but no, he completely flipped the model on its head. Paid as the directors, and they have a unique set of skills, and they're very good at what they do. But the question I wanted to ask you, I know this isn't a one-word answer. Can smaller providers still survive in this market?
Yes, I still think there's a place for it, but it's got to come with investment in the sort of things that can otherwise trip those smaller operators up. It's not going to get any easier though, I think. So there's still a place for it, but they're going to become more unique, I think. And maybe part of the future story for those single site providers is to look at those opportunities for growth or synergies or investment in a way that is going to make the business sustainable. I think in this day and age, it's like in any business. I think if you're standing still, no matter what sort of business you're running today, if you're standing still, you're probably going backwards in the longer term because of the economic factors that are playing out across the whole, not just in aged care, but in all sorts of other businesses. And we work in other sectors as well, so we certainly see that from a transactional perspective. Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the business side now, but I want to ask you a question that I've written down here regarding the human side. And that's, for many owner-operators, this isn't just a business decision. It's decades of identity, reputation and personal sacrifice. How often is the emotional side of a sale what delays good decision making?
Yeah, that's definitely a factor. Sometimes by the time the owner comes to us, they've already sort of made that emotional decision. Okay, this is what I have to do, but not always. So yes, and quite often those emotions continue to play out as we're working through a transaction process, which can be, these sort of things don't happen over weeks. They happen over months, and there are speed humps that can happen along the way if someone isn't emotionally, and if someone's not emotionally prepared to deal with that, then yes, it can be very difficult. Yeah, but I mean, I suppose the transactions happen when owners are able to separate those emotions from the underlying reasons that a transaction needs to happen or why they're at the table to start with. So I think that's assisted by having people around them that can help them, counsel them through that process, which is certainly what we try and do as well. Yeah, because it's not always an easy process for people. And often it's the first time they've been through it, first and only time, really. So it's
That's right.
There are moments that really matter to the sellers, to our clients, often in these scenarios. So we try and understand that and help them through that, because it can be difficult.
Sure. And in your experience spanning, 2 decades, what's the most common mistake you see that providers, I guess, do, leaving things too late?
Well, yes, it is leaving it too late, but again, often you don't know what you don't know if you haven't been through a process before. So I think a lot of it actually, being prepared is essential, but a lot of that comes back to getting advice from people who know what's involved and have been down the road before to actually help you become prepared. Because unless you sort of know what's coming, how can you be prepared? It's a chicken and the eggs thing. So an example we often see, particularly when we're on the buy side of a transaction, is that the seller will often use the family solicitor or their family accountant and their family advisors who have typically helped the organisation through the whole journey. So they're people that, they're highly trusted, as they should be, but they often don't know what's involved, and that can really, so again, looking sort of a bit above and beyond and looking at expertise that's out there is really important, and an important part of being prepared, and that can help the whole process.
I agree, and we've talked about it here in terms of, when you act for both sides, the buying and the selling side, but what are buyers looking at now that they weren't necessarily looking at 5 years ago?
I think that's a good question. Let me think about that. I mean, the fundamentals 5 years ago are still the same as what they were today. There's obviously a different regime.
Yes.
There's a different funding model coming through in the new legislation, which does mean that there is a renewed appetite for investment. So given that scenario, sometimes buyers will be more, they perhaps might be more acceptance of risk if there is a pathway forward to turn organisations around. That may not have been the case 5 years ago. 5 years ago too, we were, I can't remember the exact timing, but we were either in the midst of or just coming out of Royal Commission.
Correct.
COVID. So I think the business environment was different, and there was definitely the industry was really tainted by the findings of the Royal Commission, many of which were shocking, but many of which did not represent the majority of providers and the majority of the experience of what was going on out there. So I think that's a difference that I've seen play out more recently as things have recovered and turned around. But it's certainly still not without, risk, and maybe the appetite's changed though.
Mm-hmm. I
think we're seeing some big transactions now that may not have happened a little while ago, because I think that does indicate the sense of forward-looking and opportunities a bit more positive than what it might have been a little while ago.
Correct. And I know, speaking to a lot of my colleagues who are lawyers and, silks, and there's always the viewpoint of risk mitigation. You always look at the balance of probability. So I know that when you're speaking to a provider who are looking to either buy or sell, it's not an emotional one. It's one that's done from a platform of fact and the balance of probability. But the question I wanted to ask you is, and you've touched on this in terms of risk, but what are the red flags that are quietly, I guess, tainting the transaction before the seller even knows about it?
Yeah, I suppose I speak from experience of what sort of things typically create. What are the red flags raised in our reports when we do our due diligence, and also from the financial perspective, working with financial advisors? They sort of fall into three buckets, I suppose. One is definitely around the compliance. I think that's obvious. So if there are, often it's the compliance challenges that have forced the transaction. So clearly the buyer is going to want to really understand, well, what does that look like? Are they sort of isolated things, or is it something that's systemic in the organisation, which has to be addressed? So clearly in that sense, the second area is probably around workforce. It's a big cost to the business, but there's a big cost as well if you get it wrong. So what we're often seeing now is probably two issues within that. One is the underpayment claims risk. It's a very complex area in terms of what industrial instruments apply. There are different regimes that apply in different organisations, different regimes in the not-for-profit sector versus, that's right, versus the private sector. we have a whole range of industrial instruments that are operating in different businesses. Sometimes we've got enterprise agreements that are, they're coming up, they're expiring. I don't profess to be an expert in this area, but we've got a team that look at this really closely on any acquisition that we do. And it's quite common to see problems there. So it's about combining the instrument of the seller with whatever instrument the provider might have, the acquirer, and trying to match the two. And what do you have if you've got one workforce on two different arrangements? It's a really tricky area. There are pathways through it, but it's got to be something that's looked at. And well, that's the second point actually around the workforce challenge that we typically really focus on and could create flags. I think the third area is really around the financial. When you acquire an asset in the aged care sector, then you're acquiring all the liabilities that go with it. So there's always very heavy scrutiny around what's the RAD liability look like, and how do we factor that into the deal and the price. Have they been properly accounted for? Because if you're buying a facility, you want to know that you've properly factored in those liabilities so that when there's a payment requirement, then it's all been allowed for. So they're the sort of main areas that we have a real look at for, and they're often the things that create problems. So that goes back to the preparation. Getting your house in order before anything goes to market can really help, but it's not always the case that works out that way.
And speaking about, having your house in order, if a provider's looking to safeguard what they're doing, but potentially looking, as every accountant says, every business is built to be sold. But if a provider's looking to potentially sell in 2 years' time or 10 years' time, what should they be looking to get right in terms of from a foundationary perspective?
Yeah, looking to sell in 2 years versus 10 years. Well, there's clearly a lot of, even 2 years there's plenty you can do in 2 years to get your house in order. So, I think you really need to understand and look at what a buyer's going to be looking for. So it's around those three things that I just mentioned.
There's three buckets, yeah.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, if you're able to do that and have a sustainable business that's compliant, it's got a stable workforce where everyone's been properly paid, there are proper records kept around this to actually prove that everything's in order. It's going to be a much easier package to sell to someone, and that translates often into value as well. So it has a bearing on the check that you get at the end of the day. And you may also find that if you have a business that's well run and well managed, good records, and you've got a good story to tell, you won't just have one buyer who's going to be looking. You'll be able to, some of the processes we run are competitive processes where people are bidding for assets. There is an appetite out there, and there are well-resourced buyers who will compete for one another for good assets. So and that's another thing that translates into a bigger check. So even you can do a lot within those 2 years to get yourself in that position. 10 years is a luxury, I think, that a lot of people may not actually have. But, if you're looking at a growth story over 10 years, then the pathways to exit are not just exit alone. Often the pathway to exit is growth in itself. So if you can put yourself in a position over that 10-year horizon where you're actually growing a more sustainable business with a view to eventual exit, then that is a strategy that's playing out now as well. That's how the bigger players do it. They grow and they acquire and acquire again, and then with their view to exit. So it's sort of following, maybe not on that same scale that some of the bigger players are doing now, including with private equity backing and so on, but it's possible for smaller operators to do that too, if they have the resources and the capital behind them and the strategy behind it as well. So, yeah, there's more than one way to achieve the outcome.
Yeah, nice. And you've mentioned it before. I know that you've been involved in some significant transactions, obviously metro-based area, but also in rural communities as well. how important is occupancy quality to potential buyers?
I think the real question around that is the buyer is always going to look at the importance of occupancy quality from the perspective of the customers, which are the residents. So, it's no point having a high-end, high-cost of entry facility in a market that doesn't want that or doesn't have the resources to afford it. So I think it really depends on the market in which the facility operates. It's got to meet the requirements of the potential residents in that market, and it is very different across the board, whether you're looking at the wealthier suburbs in metropolitan areas versus less wealthy suburbs versus regional versus rural. There's a real spectrum, and there's a place for all of it. It's really just you've got to be able to meet the market in whatever area you're in, I think, and that's what a buyer will look for as well.
You mentioned it before, a couple of points before, talking about the RAD pool, and in terms of, on the RAD pool, how closely are buyers looking at that from a stable capital position? Is that something which is an important factor as well in terms of, the buying decision when they initially meet with your firm?
Oh, absolutely. And again, it's one of those things that goes into, well, what market am I operating in? Because I still think there's a need and appetite for RADs in those areas where, there needs to be capital investment or people expect a higher standard of accommodation. So it's got to be funded somehow. So, yeah, the RAD pool is definitely looked at from a liability perspective to make sure that the liability you think you're acquiring is what it actually is. So I think in a lot of cases too, it's the RAD pool is often seen as an uplift opportunity. Often it's fairly typical in the context of smaller providers, particularly in the not-for-profit sector. The tendency has been to really undervalue the offering, and there's often been a reluctance to set RADs at market. There's a thinking that RADs should be set below or on some sort of a discounted or concessional basis. So if a new provider's coming in looking to acquire and they can actually see upside in the opportunity to increase RADs to meet the market, then, that's a big selling factor for those sort of buyers. So yeah, we sort of see it play out in that scenario as well. It's not just a risk thing, but it's also an opportunity often.
I think so. I think what you've mentioned there, speaking from a commercial perspective, having previously worked as a facility manager, you'd want to essentially be on par with the market, and you want your RADs to be the highest they can be before you have to knock on the pricing commissioner's door. It needs to be market competitive to stay viable. So I definitely think that's important. But also, contrary to popular belief, whilst RADs are important for reinvestment into capital works and renovations, DAPs are also important as well from a cash flow perspective to pay staff. So I think a mix of both as a balanced approach is important.
Yeah, that's right. And there are different schools of thought about what that looks like under the new regime, where there is one school of thought is there is a bias towards more regular, the DAP type model for cash flow reasons. But I still think there's a place for both. It's really, again, it really comes down to the market that you're trying to serve and what their financial capacity is, what their expectations are. So it's not a one size fits all approach.
No, that's right. And you talked about, when you have those initial consultations with providers, there's a multifaceted approach in terms of different divisions within your firm that look at certain aspects. In terms of liabilities, how closely are employment liabilities sort of being looked at, and in terms of leave liabilities?
Oh, very closely. Again, we don't actually do the numbers, so we typically leave that to the financial advisors or the CFO or whoever's involved in that. But it's very common on a sales scenario for there's typically an adjustment for leave liabilities, which is basically a deduction from the price. Very common way of dealing with it. So in order to make sure that the adjustment is correctly made, you've got to understand what the liability actually is. So, yeah, it's a very important. It's often a big ticket item. There's often argy-bargy too between the parties about what the adjustment should be. Is it tax effective? Is it not? The sick leave is always something that gets debated. Is sick leave an adjustable item? Because often that's a very big number. But there's no certainty that someone's actually going to take it. So
Correct.
it's
Correct.
And so there's often a bit of toing and froing on those sort of things because the numbers do add up in that. When you've got a large workforce or a workforce that's been there for a long time, you've got the long service leave things to factor in as well. It's it's something that's always looked at. It also relates to the underpayment question because, if the leave liability is calculated based on someone's salary, so
Correct.
or their wages. So if they've been underpaid, then often the leave liability can be understated as well. So there's a real, there's a look out there for the buyer who doesn't want to acquire problems that they don't know about. If they know about them, they can manage them. But if they don't, and it's a surprise, then that can be tricky. And you can also have a lot of warranties from vendors, but then you've got to actually go and enforce. So there's other ways of protecting that risk as well with, price retentions are quite common for periods post-settlement to ensure that there's a pool of money available there that can be taken if there's an understatement or some sort of liability comes up that's known but not quantified or that's unexpected. Yeah.
Good point. It leads us into our next question. We had a guest before who's an expert in procurement. And just on the procurement side of it, are legacy supply contracts and I guess, a poor procurement structure quietly hurting value to prospective?
Yeah. So, this is another area that we typically look at from an acquisition perspective, looking at the supply inputs into the business and the key contracts. In many cases, key suppliers are just on, month to month buy-sell type arrangements. They're not locked in contracts, but that's not always the case. And often key supply chain around, key systems, procurement, or energy and those sorts of things are often, there's a price benefit or discount built into a contract, but it comes with a long-term commitment and often a termination consequence. So, that's something that a buyer won't necessarily want to inherit. And the larger buyers will typically have enterprise supply arrangements with their own preferred providers, which may be different to the providers that the vendor is using. So, that's an area that can cause problems as a vendor, if you've got locked-in contracts that the purchaser doesn't want, and then there's a termination liability, then that can be a cost to the vendor.
I agree. And do you feel that we're moving toward a sector where consolidation is no longer a trend but the default?
Possibly, but again, it's going to mean different things to different businesses and how they're positioned. So I don't think it's a given that every single facility is going to be owned by a very small number of providers. I still think there's a place for private investment, but it's got to be, it will have to have some type of scale to it. So, whether it's a trend or the default position, well, it already is the default position for a lot of providers out there, but, I think there's still room for diverse offerings by organisations that may be smaller but are well equipped and have the right people and are prepared to deal with today's challenges and meet the requirements. And again, not all providers are just financially driven. Often it's mission driven as well. And we work with a lot of not-for-profit organisations where mission really is important. And I think mission can still drive organisations if it's supported by a sustainable financial position as well.
I agree. Not for profit, but not for loss, right?
Well, that's right. And I think I look at it from a workforce perspective. If you're wanting to, do you want to work in an organisation that's successful? I think a lot of people do. It's that sort of. If you work in a successful organisation, then I think it can present opportunities for people. Now, I'm generalising a little here, but I think people want to work in sustainable, successful organisations, and I think mission and financial sustainability can coexist, and they need to coexist for that reason. Yeah, so it's sort of different stories for different organisations. Still is still what will happen in the future. But consolidation will definitely continue. I think that's just inevitable. I don't see that happening anytime soon at all.
Yeah, I agree. And the next sort of question is almost a consolidation of your previous answers to the questions. But what will the providers over the next 5 to 10 years who are successful have in common?
Well, again, I think it comes down to that financial sustainability piece. You're still going to have, there's always going to be organisations that'll be more financially successful than others, or bigger, or have bigger revenue or profit, but that's not the be-all and end-all for everyone either. So at the centre of everything has got to be about delivery of care to the residents. That's got to be central. So that come back to mission, regardless of whether you're a for-profit or not-for-profit organisation. But yeah, there's a lot of base requirements that are going to have to be ticked off by any sort of organisation that's still existing in that 10-year, over that 10-year period. And I mean, let's face it, the demand for the service is not going to diminish. So
No, correct.
The demographic factors are obvious. Residential aged care is going to cater more and more for people who are really in the last years of their lives.
Correct.
That trend has already been playing out for years now, but it's only going to get more obvious. So, yeah, I think there's room for different providers, different size providers, but yeah, they're all going to have to satisfy those base requirements.
I agree. And, if I was to put you now in the position of a provider, and if you're a provider now feeling that pressure but not ready to sell, what would be your next steps, your roadmap now?
Well, again, I think it comes down to preparation. And if you haven't been down this path before, you need to have people around you who have, and who can help you make the right decisions. And doing it with the luxury and benefit of time, rather than trying to do it in a rush when it's too late. That'd be my advice, and that would include talking to there's plenty of other CEOs and board members and lots of people who've worked as owners or executives in the industry who can help with those conversations as well. It's multifaceted. I think you've got to have a community of people around you who can help. And there's different inputs into that as well. Well, I think I've got something to offer. I'm happy to talk to anyone who's thinking about that. But there's plenty of other people. I think the aged care business is I go to a lot of the industry conferences and we get to know people in this sector, and people, it's a caring industry. And I'd say that about caring amongst peers and people who are often going through the same challenges or helping people go through those challenges. So I think it's a matter of working out who to ask, and just asking, because it is quite a community of people in this industry.
I agree. I almost believe it should be embedded into organisations' strategic plans, and not as a failure or as a measure of failure, but like you've mentioned, a measure of success. You build the organisation up, good occupancy, limited debt, good reputation in the community. Your rent prices are high, really good service offering, good provision of care, to the ability to then sort of change hands and continue that legacy. So I believe what you're saying is correct. I don't think that all of the smaller providers will be eliminated. However, you've mentioned it will be increasingly difficult to remain viable if you haven't got the correct mechanisms in place. I know you've mentioned it there, which is extend an opportunity, but obviously providers that are listening to this, if they do have concerns or wanted to speak to, they can reach out to yourself, your firm, to have those conversations and get an understanding of where they're at, essentially, a pulse check.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, again, I'm not going to have all the answers, but I know people who can help people who are looking to put a plan in place and want to speak to the right people who know what's involved. Yeah, that's all part of. We build relationships with our people, and that just doesn't mean executing a transaction. There's a lot more to it than that. So, yeah, we work in that community and sort of know people who can help. Yeah.
That's right. And on the other side, for providers who want to stay independent, what does survival, being economically viable, actually require now that it perhaps wasn't required 5 years ago? How does that look like?
Well, I suppose I look at this from a governance and regulatory perspective, obviously, as a lawyer in the space. I mean, you've got to realise that what you were doing 5 years ago is not going to cut it based on what's required today. We've had a new act, a whole lot of new rules and regulations that go under it. So you've got to be up to speed with what's going on. We've actually developed a lot of documents and policies around this to help providers do that. It's available through our RK Docs Connect channel, which is a new offering. So it's documents prepared by Russell Kennedy with the expertise that goes behind it, but in a way that's going to help organisations come up to speed with the new documentation and governance requirements on a subscription basis that is updated as and when things change. So that's one thing. I think the overall message is you can't just rely on what you were doing before to hope that it's going to be enough for now. It's just not going to be enough. So you've got to be able to keep up with what's changing, including in a legal sense. And I think bringing more people into the tent to help the organisation thrive. And that's one of the intentions, I think, behind the majority independent government director requirements with the boards, for example. Yeah. So if you're running a private operation now and you don't have a majority of independent directors sitting at the board table with you, properly appointed, then that's like a red flag straight up. So those requirements have been in place for a couple of years now. So
yeah, correct.
There's often some pretty obvious things that can be changed and should change.
And there's legal liability for.
Yeah, that's right.
So, yeah.
Now, I'm just talking about the legal side. There's a lot of other stuff out there that you've just got to be across. So you need to surround yourself with people who know and can help. Yeah.
Great. And in terms of the future of aged care, do you still think there's room for independence and growth for smaller providers, or is it partnership scale and more strategic alignment, the likes of recently Infinite Care, and they've used the word strategic alignment? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I still do think there is room for all of the above. I don't think it's necessarily all going to go into the larger operators. And when I say larger, I mean the larger, either ASX listed or private equity owned businesses. Larger also includes a lot of the not-for-profit faith-based organisations, which are really big in their own right now, and they're getting bigger. I still think there's a place for that private investment. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but only if that private investment I think there's got to be a growth mindset there, a change, preparedness for change. Otherwise, I think if you're just doing the same thing that you did 5 years ago, it's just not going to work over the longer term. It's not sustainable because things are changing so much around, and again, not just aged care specific, but the broader economic factors that increase the cost to the business. That's got to be matched by some sort of uplift or improvement to make it sustainable.
I agree. Interesting question, this one here, and just sidestepping slightly, but I know that you would have the eyes and ears for this. Do you think, I know Regis are floating on the ASX now, do you think there are any providers that are soon to join them on the ASX?
Well, Regis have been on the ASX for years, so yeah.
Correct.
Well, there's investment. You've got Bain with Estia, and then the Pacific Equity Partners recently acquired 50% of Opal. They're the bigger public for-profit operators. It's not hard to see that one day there's going to be a new approach to the ASX for them as well.
Very diplomatic answer here.
Well, I don't have any direct insight into that.
Sure.
I can't talk about things that we're working on.
No,
but
that's right.
I'm not saying anything that's not public anyway.
Yeah, correct.
But the ASX goes through its own challenges, though. So it's not necessarily the be all and end all.
No.
At the moment the share prices fluctuate for a whole lot of different reasons. It's not necessarily indicative of underlying value. So and we've worked with other providers in the sector over the years that have been down the path of looking at this, but eventually pulling back. So it's not a decision taken lightly, but the benefits are there. With if you're looking for capital, then that's an avenue that opens up that capital up. But it's an interesting time at that end of the market. Interestingly, another thing that we've been challenged with at the moment that sort of goes counter to government policy around this is the ACCC merger clearance requirements, meaning that there's a whole lot of transactions now under the new regime that are captured by notification and clearance requirement that weren't captured before. And, all of those operators will be subject to this new regime, which can actually act as a barrier to transactions. So it's quite an interesting space at the moment. And, one side of government policy that sort of runs counterintuitive to the other, which says that more consolidation is going to happen, or needs to happen. So it's going to be a fluid area, I think, for many years to come. Yeah.
Agree. And finally, for the providers sitting in that uncomfortable middle ground right now, not in crisis, but no longer confident they can keep doing it the way they always have, what do they need to face now?
They need to have a strategy, and there's no right or wrong strategy, but I think unless you have a strategy and you've got a plan to work towards achieving it, then you run the risk of becoming directionless. And then when you're faced with a situation where you have to make a decision, you're not ready for it. So it's really about having a strategy, whether that's a strategy for further growth, further improvement, or whether that's a strategy for exit. They're all good strategies that can work and just need the right preparation and the right expertise feeding into it to ensure that you're giving it the best chance of success. But it's like any industry. Being in that middle ground can be difficult if you don't have a plan. And doing what you were doing 5 years ago is not a plan. It's not the sort of thing that's going to enable the organisation to realise whatever the owners and the board and the management want to achieve.
I agree. You shared a lot of interesting insights here, perspectives, definitely showing your years of experience and your firm's experience. Thank you for your time, Rohan.
It's been a pleasure. Good to talk to you, Mark. And we like working in the industry, and it's certainly very rewarding to help people through these sort of processes, and that's why we've been doing it for a long time. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Rohan. Thank you.